Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 22nd of June, as we are beginning to move into the tail end of the semester. I wanted to talk just a few minutes about Jane Eyre and then move to Emily Dickinson. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of our upcoming dates. As you know, we are a little bit behind, but we can catch up because the texts that are left for us aren't nearly as complex as the texts that we had addressed in the earlier part of the semester. So next week we get to do Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I think you'll see that it moves very quickly, and we are able to get a narrative from a female slave about her experiences. Just think about the contrast between something like that and the world of privilege of persuasion. And then finally, we end with The Awakening, which happens to be a novella by Kate Chopin. And you'll remember we began the semester with Kate Chopin talking about the story of an hour. So The Awakening is about a woman's spiritual and physical awakening, and basically led to Chopin being blacklisted, was the ending of her career. What we've got after that is a 4th of July weekend, and then finally our last class, which is devoted to the final examination. And what I will do is I will post the final exam and give you 24 hours in which to answer the final exam questions. So if we were meeting in person, you would have 2 hours. So I anticipate that you should spend approximately 2 hours on the exam, even though I would give you 24 hours for that examination. And this is also the time in which your paper number 2 would be due, which is going to be very similar to paper number 1. So as you know, I have returned paper number 1 for those of you who submitted in paper number 1 prior to the extension. Those of you who took that extension, I'm in the midst of returning those papers to you. You have the option of revising that paper for a higher grade once I have reviewed it. I just ask that you submit in the original with my comments along with your revision, and you would get the higher of the 2 grades. You have until the ending of the semester, but as I had indicated, the semester is quickly coming to a close. So basically, the ending for us is July 7th. But we still have a little bit of time left to talk about things like Jane Eyre. For the final exam, and I believe I'd mentioned this earlier, it will be an essay exam and it will be open book, open notes. So certainly you're free to utilize things such as the class discussion forums, the journals that you've written, and also your previous papers. And it certainly won't be as well developed or as well written as something that you would do at home over a longer period of time, but I'm hoping that you can synthesize all of the elements of the semester within some of those essay questions, and I will give you choice within those questions as well. And that's it. If you've been reading the novels and watching the class videos and reading the class discussion forum responses, you should be just fine for the final examination. It's not an exam in which you're required to memorize information. It's an exam in which you are required to synthesize some of the major themes or points that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And in terms of paper number 2, I'm hopeful that you have begun thinking at least about paper number 2. Paper number 1 was devoted to the earlier sets of writing in the semester. So paper number 2 will be devoted to the later sets of writing in the semester. That probably means Jane Eyre, unless you elected to write about Jane Eyre for the first paper. You don't want to write 2 papers on the same text. Or that could mean Emily Dickinson, which we're going to talk about today. Or it would probably mean Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl or The Awakening, because as you will see with Emily Dickinson, I'm using her as a kind of transition into the latter part of this semester. That's not to say that you can't write about Emily Dickinson. Just like with your first paper, you were able to write about the short story, The Story of an Hour. But writing about a poem or writing about a short story is very different than writing about a novel. as I'm sure you are aware. So it's just a different way of proceeding. Approximately 4 to 5 page paper, critical paper, so you wouldn't need to use outside resources. Very similar to what you did with paper number 1. And paper number 2, due at the very ending of the semester, doesn't have the option of a revision because the semester's over at that point. But the idea is that you would have learned the process of how to write a paper with your first paper, so therefore you could just incorporate that into your second paper. So where you should be now in terms of the semester is you should have put closure onto reading Jane Eyre. So the Dickinson work that we're going to do today is a way for you to catch your breath, so to speak, before we finish up the semester with Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and The Awakening. And in terms of Emily Dickinson, and you can see this in the notes below in the second section, there is a biography that I wanted you to watch, and it is about 56 minutes long, so I will keep today's video short so that you can watch that, which I think does a really good job of not only talking about Emily Dickinson, but also citing much of her poetry. It came out in 1987, so it is dated, but again, I think that what you will see, much as you see with all great works of literature, they are timeless and universal. What you will find with Emily Dickinson's poetry is that it both reveals and conceals. I admit I always was a bit hesitant about Emily Dickinson's poetry, in part because I didn't understand it. And one of the things you'll see in this documentary is that you've got some Dickinson scholars themselves admitting they don't always understand Emily Dickinson's poetry, which I think helps to alleviate a lot of the stress that a reader might feel in trying to understand everything that she's saying. She wrote an enormous number of poems, over 1,700, highly compressed poems without any titles, so we refer to them by their first names. And if you know anything at all about Emily Dickinson's story, and the biography will talk about this, she wrote for herself rather than being published, and they were published after her death. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is that they were edited and they were standardized for things like punctuation or for spelling, which you would never do with the poet, because poetry in particular is a literary form that's quite free and doesn't have to follow the conventions of grammatical English. So when you're reading an Emily Dickinson poem, you need to be careful and make sure that you are reading what she originally wrote and not what was edited. It was only until years later that an editor by the name of Johnson published her poetry in the way that she originally wrote it, and that's when it became quite interesting, or at least for scholars and critics in terms of interest. And again, the documentary will talk about that. And a quick and easy way to determine if you're reading Emily Dickinson's poetry in its original form as opposed to its edited form is if you've got poetry with dashes. She was very fond of the dash and oftentimes used the dash in place where you would use a comma from standard convention. And I think it makes a lot of sense that she would have this unorthodox writing style. Not only do we have that, but we have flexible rhyme and also unusual capitalizations. I think it illustrates her defiance of convention, which also was illustrated in her lifestyle as well, which you will see in the documentary. She even followed some of the patterns of Protestant rhythms, or hymnals, which the documentary will also discuss as well. So in some ways, it could be seen as a questioning of Orthodox religion. And what you'll see is a lot of paradox and contradiction in her poetry. One of my favorite lines is the woe of ecstasy. And that her poetry was quite personal. She wrote about herself, but it's also universal because she talks about emotional states. And she oftentimes talked about death. So many people critique Dickinson as being a rather dark writer. I disagree in that just because she's talking about death, that doesn't necessarily mean that she portrays it in a negative manner. In fact, she often portrays death as a positive, that it's just merely a way to transition over into the afterlife. And some of the themes that you'll see with Emily Dickinson's poetry are things like love and loss and religion and nature. In her mind, this is where you found God, within nature itself. Loneliness and defiance. And of course, if you are a New Englander, especially if you live in Western Massachusetts, you probably know that she attended Mount Holyoke College. So the documentary will also talk about that as well. And her homestead is in Amherst, Massachusetts. And if you look in the notes below at the bottom of the second section, I have included a link to Emily Dickinson's homestead so that you could actually examine what it's like. It's a museum now for which you could go on tour. And that said, I don't have a journal due for Emily Dickinson because instead what I wanted us to do was to devote our discussion forum question to Emily Dickinson. If you had ordered the text that I had assigned for this class, then you have Emily Dickinson's Final Harvest. But as you know, you weren't necessarily required to order the text because I will be also providing you with links as well. And while I can't necessarily provide you a link to all 1,700 of her poems, I can give you a poetry link where there are multiples of her poems. You can, of course, look online as well and find copies of her poems, and of course, libraries have them as well. Because what your assignment is going to be after you watch that documentary is to either identify one Emily Dickinson poem. Remember, there's 1,700, and no, I do not expect you to read 1,700 poems. Or even one line within a poem that you find to be particularly powerful, and explain why. And that would be in your discussion forum responses. And next class, what I will do is I will share with you a poem that I find to be particularly powerful, and I will explain why. But I don't want to give any spoilers at this point, so I won't be telling you now, but I will be telling you next class. And we'll analyze that poem together. But in this way, after watching the documentary, after listening to some of your classmates, or reading, I should say, some of your classmates' responses about either a poem or even a line within Emily Dickinson's poems that tends to speak to you. I always think of a line that oftentimes is quoted at graduations, including GCC graduations. I dwell in possibility. And I love that line. You know, the idea of that possibility suggests hope and opportunity. It works so well for something like a graduation. And dwell, and all of the multiple meanings of dwell, whether it be a home, it's a place in which you reside, which is what college is, I suppose, but also to dwell or to obsess over. That's just one example of many of the examples of Emily Dickinson's poetry. Probably one of my favorite lines of her poetry is, one not need to be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. But at any rate, that sort of leads us to talking a little bit about Jane Eyre. So feel free to poke around with Emily Dickinson, either reading a lot of her poetry or a little bit of her poetry, and try to find a poem or at least a line that speaks to you. Perhaps it was something that was discussed in the biography, and put that in our discussion forum. Of course, that'll count for your attendance for the class, and talk a little bit about why you found it to be so moving or so powerful. And after you read all of your classmates' responses and watch that documentary and listen to the poem that I select, I think you'll have a good background a little bit with Emily Dickinson. Now, I don't have a journal due for Emily Dickinson, but if you wanted to earn a little bit of extra credit in class, you could submit in a journal for Emily Dickinson, and I would count that as an extra credit, much like the other journals that you're doing. But the journal that would be due today, rather than if today being the 22nd, if you were watching this on Thursday, the journal that would be due today is not on Emily Dickinson, and it happens to be on Jane Eyre. So my hope again is that you have finished Jane Eyre and that you are in the midst, hopefully, of reading Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which means that you would just have one last major text, which happens to be a novella, The Awakening, a novella being longer than a short story, but not quite as long as a novel. So, in terms of thinking a little bit about Jane Eyre, the last discussion forum question I had asked you was to identify a quote that you thought was powerful in Jane Eyre, and there are quite a few. And I thought what I would do to put some closure onto Jane Eyre is to identify some of my favorite quotes about Jane Eyre. And then I will leave you to watch the biography about Dickinson and also to poke around a little bit with Dickinson's poetry and see if you can find something to discuss in the discussion forum. So, in terms of Jane Eyre, I had indicated that names are so important. You know, you want to think about something like Gateshead. A gate is something that will trap you. You want to think about something like Lowood, a place that's low with poor conditions. You want to think about something like Thornfield, a place that has fields, so lots of hope, possibility, expansiveness, but thorns, lots of pain as well. Moor House, where Jane finds more. She ends up finding out that she has family and also that she has money. And think about persuasion. And if a woman had financial independence, that put her in a very different kind of situation. And I wonder if you've noticed the title Jane Eyre. Not only is Jane appropriate when we talk about plain Janes, if you've ever heard that expression, which applies to Jane. She's physically unattractive, or at least not physically attractive. And we know how important bloom is, so to speak, after reading Persuasion. But Eyre, Eyre, is pronounced just like an heir, Heir, and she is the heir to a fortune, in effect. So, some foreshadowing right there in the title of the book that basically gives away the happy ending, because not only does Jane find family, and not only does Jane receive inheritance, so now she has financial independence, but in the end, Jane also finds love, and she marries because of love. And she doesn't have to compromise herself nor her morals. At this point, both Rochester and Jane have been humbled, so that one could say that they've earned the right to be with one another. Of course, there is a bit of a tidy ending, so perhaps we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief. Rochester is a widower at this point. He tried to save his mad wife, Bertha Mason, and was unsuccessful. So, of course, if his wife were still living, that would be a polygamous relationship with Jane. That would not give us the happy ending. And we know that Jane, at the very beginning of the novel, talked about that she was too proud to live with poor people. And even though she was quite miserable with the Reeds. And we do know that prior to arriving at Moor House, Jane is basically relegated to the role of a pauper and literally begging and using Mother Nature as the universal protector, a kind of mother figure, if you will, a theme that we've seen in things like Frankenstein. And we certainly know about Rochester's arrogance, and he too has been humbled, and not just in terms of his not having the kind of physical abilities that he would have had in the past because he's maimed through the fire, but also that he has to accept the help of others, including the help of Jane, and he's willing to accept a certain level of spirituality in his life. And religion and spirituality is an element in this novel, not necessarily the harsh religious doctrine of organized religion. This is not the Brocklehurst of Lowood, who are hypocrites, nor is this the St. John, who's just so rigid in his religion, or let's say even an Eliza, as we learn a little bit more about Jane's cousins in adulthood, after Jane is called back again to her Aunt Reed and hears on Aunt Reed's deathbed, in effect, that there are relatives that Jane has, but just out of spite and vindictiveness, Aunt Reed hasn't shared that information with Jane. We know that Jane's three cousins, we've got two women, and of course, as a women in literature class, it's so important to see how female is presented in these texts. We've got Georgiana and Eliza, and Georgiana becomes rather spoiled and self-centered, almost like many of the spoiled, self-centered, privileged women of persuasion that we saw. And then we have Eliza, who basically goes to the other extreme of deprivation and harsh religious doctrine. And As we've seen in so many texts before, it's all about balance. It's about avoiding the extremes. It's one of the reasons why Helen Burns does not survive. This is Jane's friend when they're at Lowood, because Helen Burns is thinking too much about the afterlife rather than thinking about the pleasures of this life. And that's one of the messages within Jane Eyre, is to enjoy the pleasure of this life, as well as the message of maintaining one's self-respect, even in the face of disrespect. And in that way, I think it makes Jane a very modern heroine. Of course, I had also mentioned a little bit some of the Gothic elements of the text, so it's very similar to Frankenstein in some sense. There is, a mystery in this sort of large and decrepit edifice. And we know that Jane has all of these haunting nightmares that seem to be prophetic. And even the ending of the novel perhaps has a supernatural element when both she and Rochester hear each other's voices calling out to one another, even though they're in different locales. There really is no explanation for that. So perhaps there is a small supernatural element. But we also get a traditional love story and an untraditional love story, because it's not common for a governess to be with her master. And again, persuasion helps to set up this idea about the importance of social station. Of course, by the time Jane is a financially independent woman, that completely changes the dynamic of their story. And that said, a few of the quotes that I wanted to draw your attention to in Jane Eyre, and I'm aware that your page numbers might be different than perhaps my page numbers. Talking a little bit about, and I think I've mentioned this before, that Jane might be the first heroine to know, and this was in the introduction, that she needed her own identity more than she needed marriage. And again, that's a rather bold thing to say even in today's world. But in terms of some of the quotes from the actual text itself, one of my favorites happens to be in chapter 12. And for me, this is on page 111, and where Jane is talking a little bit about how she is feeling the need to exert some activity. And she says, "It's vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine. Millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions besides political rebellions ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a constraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags." And this was a very similar kind of message that we got in Persuasion. It's just much more direct. And another one of my favorite quotes, and this is in chapter 19. And again, Rochester is not necessarily supposed to come off as a particularly attractive character. He's very much in the vein of the Byronic hero, very dark and brooding, and a dark secret that he's keeping close to his chest, and that he needs to undergo some sort of a transformation, a reformation, if you will. But when he's pretending to be that gypsy, he tells Jane, "You're cold because you're alone. No contact strikes the fire from you that is in you. You are sick because the best of feelings, the highest and the sweetest given to man, keeps far away from you. You are silly because, suffer as you may, you will not beckon it to approach, nor will you stir one step to meet it where it wants you." Of course, this is quite cruel in many respects, because there certainly is a difference in station between Jane and Rochester, so it's not as if she could approach him. And also, we know that Rochester is basically toying with Jane's emotions. And of course, he's going to need to undergo some sort of a transformation. And part of that is the pain and the suffering that he experiences in the fire in Thornfield, so that he can become a better person. And he continues as a gypsy, saying that in Jane's brow, he can see it say, I can live alone if self-respect and circumstances, for me this is on page 204, if self-respect and circumstances require me to do so. I need not sell my soul to buy bliss. I have an inward treasure born with me which can keep me alive if all extraneous delights should be withheld or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give. The forehead declares, reason sits firm and holds the rein, and she will not let the feelings burst away and hurry to wild chasms. The passion may rage furiously, like the true heathens as they are, and the desires may imagine all sorts of vain things, but judgment shall still have the last word in every argument. And again, this idea of being able to temper passion with reason and rationality is one of the major themes that we see in the text. And of course, I was talking a little bit about Georgiana and Eliza. We learn a little bit more about them in their adulthood on page 240, for instance. And this happens to be, let's see if I can find the chapter. This is one of the later chapters. This is after Jane returns to Mrs. Reed's house because Mrs. Reed is on her deathbed. This is towards the ending of chapter 21. And of course, the two sisters spend their time bickering with one another. And what one accuses the other of, everybody knows you are the most selfish, heartless creature in existence. And I know your spiteful hatred towards me. That's what Georgiana says. I have had a specimen of it before in the trick you played me about Lord Edwin Vere. You could not bear me to be raised above you, to have a title, to be received into circles where you dare not show your face. And so you acted the spy and informer and ruined my prospects forever. And then she takes out her handkerchief and blows her nose for an hour afterwards. Again, I always think about someone like Mary in Persuasion. And of course, Eliza has her own statement to her sister on page 239, saying, Georgiana, a more vain and absurd animal than you was certainly never allowed to cumber the earth. You had no right to be born, for you make no use of life. Instead of living for, in, and within yourself, as a reasonable being ought to, you seek only to fasten your feebleness on some other person's strength. No one can be found willing to burden her or himself with such a fat, weak, puffy, useless thing. You cry out that you are ill-treated. Remember Mary, always talking about being ill-used. Neglected, miserable. Then too existence must be a scene of continual change and excitement, or else the world is a dungeon. You must be admired, you must be courted, you must be flattered, you must have music, dancing, society, or you languish, you die away. Have you no sense to devise a system in which will make you independent of all efforts and all wills but your own? Take one day, share it into sections. To each section, apportion its task. Leave no stray unemployed quarter of an hour, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, include all. Do each piece of business in its turn with method, with rigid regularity. The day will close almost before you are aware it has begun. And of course, we see the extremes. No one wants to live that kind of life without any kind of passion or any kind of hope. But no one wants to go to the extreme of not having morality either. And that's the moral of the message of this particular text. And as we go on, the text, we learn that ultimately Jane is rather modern. She talks a little bit about how she's able to keep Rochester in check, for instance, when they are courting. This is on page 278, that she doesn't want him to spoil her or to descend into a romantic nonsense. That the best way, basically, to keep him in check was to tease him. So there were no more honeyed terms such as love and darling on his lips. Instead, it was malicious elf and sprite. And Jane talks a little bit about how she was certain that she was doing well and that she laughed in her sleeve, saying, I can keep you in reasonable check now. So this is basically how a woman has the ability to control a man. Of course, we learn that Rochester has kept a terrible secret from her and that he is married and she can't compromise her morals. And it says in chapter 27, you shall tear yourself away. She's talking to herself. Of course, this is an adult Jane who is reflecting back on past events. You shall tear yourself away. None shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye. Think about the foreshadowing of what happens with Rochester. Yourself cut off your right hand. Again, think about what happens with Rochester after the fire. Your heart shall be the victim, and you the priest to transfix it. And of course, when she's at one of her lowest points and she knows that she has to leave Rochester and go off on her own, even if this means that she has to be a pauper, I will care for myself, she says on page 322 of my version of Jane Eyre. I'm trying to see if I can find the chapter. This is a rather long chapter. This is towards the ending of chapter 27. I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold on to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad, as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, and violate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I've always believed. And if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire, my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. The idea that ultimately, we know that Jane is human, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, though in chapter 31, Jane talks a little bit about how ultimately she's given, it seems, a lowly position where she has to be the teacher of the poor. And she's grateful for the opportunity because it allows her to earn a certain level of income. Keep in mind that Rochester, before she left Rochester, wanted her to give up her job as a governess, and she refused. And think about how bold that would be. But at any rate, in chapter 31, Jane talks about that, yes, I felt desolate and degraded, that she's going to now be reduced to being a teacher of the poor. I doubted I had taken a step which sank instead of raised me in the scale of social existence. I was weakly dismayed at the ignorance, the poverty, the coarseness of all I heard and saw round me. But let me not hate and despise myself too much for these feelings. I know them to be wrong. This is a great step gained. I shall strive to overcome them. So even Jane has her struggles, but when she basically realizes that she can't be with St. John because she doesn't have passion for him and he's just too strict in his religious doctrine, she says on page 421, God did not give me my life to throw away and do as you would wish me do. And I think that's an incredibly progressive statement. Again, not just necessarily for that time, but for this time as well. And that's in chapter 35. So those are just a few of my favorite quotes when it comes to Jane Eyre. And of course, I had asked you to talk about in the discussion forum your favorites. And while you know you're not required to respond to your classmates, I do ask that you read your classmates' responses. I leave you now to watch the documentary about Emily Dickinson and to answer our attendance question, which would be due Saturday the 24th at 9 a.m. To identify one Emily Dickinson poem, or at least one line of a poem that you find to be particularly powerful, and explain why. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class talking about incidents in the life of a slave girl. Take care. Bye-bye.